The scorching Arizona sun beat down on Jessie Harper's shoulders as she trudged along the dusty road leading into Gila Bend. The hem of her threadbare dress was coated with dirt, and her once prized boots were scuffed beyond recognition. She kept her head down, not just from exhaustion after walking for miles, but from habit letting her long, chestnut hair fall forward to shield her face from curious eyes. The year was 1878, and the small town of Gila Bend, Arizona Territory, wasn't much to look at, just a collection of wooden structures clustered around the stagecoach line and the newly built Southern Pacific Railroad stop. But to Jessie, it represented something she hadn't dared hope for in years, a chance to disappear. Her fingers absently traced the fading bruise along her jaw, Thomas's parting gift, before she'd finally gathered the courage to flee in the middle of the night 3 days ago. 5 years of marriage had taught her that men's promises of love could turn to cruelty faster than summer rain evaporated in the desert. The bustle of the town grew louder as she approached. A group of men lounged outside the saloon, their laughter carrying on the hot breeze. Jessie tensed, her pace slowing. She'd need work and a place to stay, but approaching strangers, especially men, made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Watch yourself, madam," a deep voice called as a horse and rider nearly barreled into her from a side street. Jessie stumbled backward, catching herself against a hitching post. Her hair fell further across her face, and she didn't move to push it away. "My apologies," the rider said, dismounting in one fluid movement. "Rusty here gets mighty excited when he knows he's headed for water and feed." Jessie mumbled something unintelligible, eyes fixed on the dust at her feet. The man was tall, she could tell that much without looking up, and his boots were worn but well cared for. "You look like you've been traveling a spell," he continued, his voice gentler now. "New to Gila Bend?" She nodded slightly, still not meeting his gaze. "Name's Vaughn Wilson," he offered. "I run the livery stable just up the street." When she didn't immediately respond, he added, "Town small, but decent folks mostly. Mrs. Dalton over at the boarding house takes in travelers if you're needing a place." Jessie finally found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered, the words almost carried away by the breeze. Vaughn Wilson studied her for a moment, noting her tense shoulders and the way she seemed to fold in on herself. "If you don't mind my asking, madam, are you all right?" The question was so simple, so direct, that Jessie felt tears threatening. No one had asked her that in years. I'm fine," she managed. "Just tired from the road." He nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't quite believe her. "Well, Mrs. Dalton's is the white building with blue trim 2 blocks up. Tell her Vaughn sent you. She'll treat you fair." With a tip of his hat, he led his horse away, leaving Jessie standing in the street, her knuckles white around the handle of her small carpetbag. The Dalton boarding house was exactly where Vaughn had said it would be, a neat 2-story structure with window boxes spilling over with hardy desert flowers. Jessie hesitated at the front door, gathering her courage. She hadn't expected kindness from a stranger, and it had thrown her off balance. Mrs. Dalton proved to be a plump, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who barely blinked when Jessie mentioned Vaughn's name, simply nodded and showed her to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. "Supper's at 6 sharp," she informed Jessie. "Bathrooms at the end of the hall. Hot water costs extra on days other than Saturday." Jessie nodded, relieved by the woman's businesslike manner. No prying questions, no pitying looks. "And Mrs. Dalton added as she turned to leave, "whatever you're running from, it hasn't followed you here yet. You might try breathing a little." The door closed with a gentle click, leaving Jessie alone in the small room. She sank onto the narrow bed, her body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a deep breath. The room had a small mirror above the washstand, and Jessie caught a glimpse of herself, hair hanging in limp strands around her face, the bruise on her jaw now a sickly yellow-green. She quickly looked away. Thomas had made it clear over the years that no one would ever find her beautiful, that she was lucky he'd taken her in. The words had settled into her bones until they became truth. That night, after a simple meal that tasted better than anything she'd had in months, Jessie lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Gila Bend. Somewhere a piano played in the saloon and occasionally laughter drifted up from the street. She would need to find work tomorrow. Her small stash of money saved penny by penny from household funds over years wouldn't last long. The next morning dawned bright and hot, typical for May in the Arizona territory. Jessie dressed in her second dress, only marginally better than the one she'd arrived in. After a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, she ventured out, determined to find employment before her courage failed her. The town was fully awake now, with wagons and riders moving along the main street and storekeepers sweeping their boardwalks. Jessie kept her head down, her hair arranged to cover as much of her face as possible. She had already inquired at the general store and the small hotel, both of which had no need for help. As she passed the milliner's shop, a sign in the window caught her eye. "Assistant needed, inquire within." Jessie paused, her heart beating a little faster. She had always been good with a needle, one of the few skills her mother had taught her before consumption had taken her when Jessie was 15. The bell above the door tinkled as she entered, and a woman looked up from behind a counter where she was arranging ribbons. "Good morning," the woman said cheerfully. "How can I help you today?" I saw your sign," Jessie said, gesturing vaguely toward the window, "about needing an assistant." The woman, Mrs. Porter, as she introduced herself, looked Jessie up and down with a shrewd eye. "Do you so, miss?" "Harper, Jessie Harper, and yes, madam, I do," Mrs. Porter nodded. "Let's see your hands, then." Jessie held out her hands, which, despite the roughness of her journey, showed the calluses of someone accustomed to fine needlework. "Can you start today?" Mrs. Porter asked, apparently satisfied. "Pays not much to begin with, $4 a week, but if you prove yourself, we can discuss more." "Yes, madam," Jessie agreed, hardly believing her luck. "I can start right away." By noon, Jessie was stationed at a small table in the back of the shop, carefully stitching beadwork onto a hat destined for the banker's wife. The work was precise and absorbing, allowing her mind to quiet for the first time in days. Mrs. Porter, though brisk, was fair and left Jessie mostly to herself, which suited her perfectly. As the afternoon wore on, the bell above the door rang frequently as customers came and went. Jessie kept her head down, focusing on her work and grateful that her position in the back corner kept her mostly out of sight. The shop had nearly emptied when the bell chimed again. Jessie didn't look up, concentrating on a particularly delicate section of beading. "Afternoon, Mrs. Porter," a familiar voice called. "Got that hat ready for Mrs. Johnson. She's been asking after it." Jessie's fingers stilled. "It was the man from yesterday, Vaughn Wilson." "Mr. Wilson," Mrs. Porter replied warmly. "Indeed I do. Your timing is excellent. Miss Harper here just finished the beadwork this morning and it turned out beautifully." Jessie kept her eyes fixed on her work as Mrs. Porter bustled over to a shelf and brought down a hat box. "Miss Harper," Vaughn's voice held a note of pleased surprise. "Well now. Looks like you found your footing in Gila Bend after all." Jessie nodded without looking up, murmuring a quiet "Yes, sir." "Mrs. Porter's lucky to have you," he continued. "Not many with the patience for that fine work." Mrs. Porter laughed. "Don't I know it? This young woman has a real gift." Been a blessing already, and only her first day. The praise made Jessie's cheeks warm, and she ducked her head further, letting her hair swing forward to hide her face completely. "Well, I'll be sure to pass that along to Mrs. Johnson," Vaughn said. "She'll be pleased to hear her hat was in such capable hands." After paying for the hat, he paused near Jessie's table. "Glad to see you settling in, Miss Harper," he said quietly. "Gila Bend's not such a bad place once you get to know it." She nodded again without looking up, and after a moment, he moved away. The bell chimed as he left, and Jessie released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The rest of the day passed without incident, and by closing time, Jessie had finished another hat and started work on a veil for a wedding order. Mrs. Porter seemed pleased with her work and told her to return at 8 the next morning. As Jessie walked back to the boarding house in the golden light of late afternoon, she allowed herself a small flutter of hope. Perhaps here, in this dusty little town, she could build something for herself, a quiet life, free from fear. The routine of work and the boarding house quickly became comfortable. Days passed, then weeks. Jessie kept to herself, speaking little but working diligently. Her skill with a needle impressed Mrs. Porter enough that, after 3 weeks, her wages increased to $5 weekly. It wasn't much, but it covered her room and board with a little left over, which she carefully saved. She occasionally saw Vaughn Wilson around town. His livery stable was only a few buildings down from the millinery shop, but their interactions remained brief and polite. He always greeted her kindly, but never pressed for conversation when she offered little in return. There was something about him that unsettled her, though not in the way Thomas had. Vaughn's gentle manner and patient eyes made her feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely compelling. But Jessie had learned the hard way that men's kindness often came with a price, and she wasn't willing to pay it again. June melted into July, bringing heat that shimmered above the dusty streets. Jessie adapted to the rhythm of the small town, finding comfort in its predictability. Mrs. Dalton had begun to nod approvingly when Jessie came down for breakfast, noting that she was putting on a bit of flesh, thank goodness. The constant gnawing fear that Thomas might find her began to ease, though it never fully disappeared. One evening, as Jessie was walking back to the boarding house after work, the piece of her new routine was shattered. A group of cowboys, fresh off the trail and flush with their wages, had taken over the saloon. Their raucous laughter spilled into the street as Jessie passed. "Well, looky here, boys," one called out, his words slurring slightly. "Pretty little thing, ain't she?" Jessie quickened her pace, eyes fixed on the ground, her heart suddenly thundering in her chest. "Hey now, don't be shy," another voice called. "We're just being friendly." The sound of boot steps behind her sent ice through her veins. Jessie broke into a run, but a hand grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "What's your hurry, sweetheart?" The man's breath reeked of whiskey. "We just want to let her go, Daniels." Vaughn Wilson stood a few paces away, his stance casual but his eyes hard as flint. "Aw, Wilson, we're just having some fun," the cowboy protested, though his grip on Jessie's arm loosened. "Doesn't look like the lady's enjoying your idea of fun," Vaughn replied evenly. "Best move along now." There was a tense moment when Jessie thought the drunken cowboy might argue, but something in Vaughn's steady gaze seemed to penetrate the man's alcohol-fogged brain. With a muttered curse, he released Jessie's arm and stumbled back toward the saloon, his companions following. Jessie stood frozen, her arms wrapped protectively around herself, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Miss Harper," Vaughn's voice was gentle. "Are you all right?" She nodded jerkily, still unable to speak, her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere past his shoulder. "May I walk you to Mrs. Dalton's?" he asked. "No obligation for conversation, just to ensure you get there safely." Jessie hesitated, then nodded again. They walked in silence, Vaughn keeping a respectful distance. When they reached the boarding house, he tipped his hat and turned to leave without further comment. "Thank you," Jessie whispered, the words barely audible. Vaughn paused, looking back at her with a small smile. "You're welcome, Miss Harper. Good night." The incident left Jessie shaken, memories of Thomas's rough hands and angry words flooding back. She slept poorly that night, jerking awake at every creak of the old house. The next morning, she nearly decided to stay in her room, the thought of venturing out into the town overwhelming. But the prospect of losing her position at the millinery, the first thing that had been truly hers in years, propelled her out the door. She kept her head down as she walked to work, her hair falling forward to shield her face. The streets were quieter this morning, the cowboys presumably sleeping off their night of revelry. Still, Jessie's shoulders remained tense, her steps quick. As she passed the livery stable, the sound of someone calling her name made her freeze. "Miss Harper." Vaughn stepped out of the stable doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. "Good morning." Jessie nodded in acknowledgement, not trusting her voice. "I wanted to apologize for those men last night," he said, his tone serious. "That's not typical behavior for Gila Bend. Sheriff had a word with them after I reported the incident. They've moved on this morning." Relief washed through her, though she remained wary. "Thank you," she murmured. "No need for thanks," Vaughn replied. "It wasn't right what they did." He hesitated, then added, "If you ever feel unsafe walking home, my stable hand or I would be happy to escort you. No strings attached." The offer was made casually, with no hint of expectation. Jessie looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for perhaps the first time. They were a warm brown, steady and calm. I'll remember that," she said softly. Vaughn nodded, seemingly content with her response. "Have a good day, Miss Harper." The exchange left Jessie unsettled in a different way than the incident with the Cowboys. Vaughn's kindness came with no apparent agenda, no underlying current of ownership or entitlement. It was foreign territory, and she wasn't sure how to navigate it. At the millinery shop, Mrs. Porter kept Jessie busy with a large order for the upcoming Founders' Day celebration in August. The work was a welcome distraction, allowing Jessie to lose herself in the precision of tiny stitches and careful placement of feathers and ribbons. As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Porter surprised Jessie by asking her to deliver a finished hat to Mrs. Johnson, the banker's wife. "She lives just 3 blocks over," Mrs. Porter explained, carefully placing the hat in a box. "Normally I'd go myself, but my lumbago is acting up something fierce today. Would you mind terribly, dear?" Jessie hesitated. She had thus far managed to avoid most interactions with the townspeople beyond necessary pleasantries, but she couldn't refuse her employer. "Of course," she agreed quietly, taking the hat box. Mrs. Johnson's house was one of the finer homes in Gila Bend, a 2-story brick structure with actual glass windows instead of oiled paper. Jessie approached the front door with trepidation, rehearsing what she would say. The door was opened by a maid who led Jessie to a sitting room where Mrs. Johnson was entertaining several other ladies for afternoon tea. Jessie's discomfort increased as all eyes turned to her. "Ah, the new girl from Mrs. Porter's," Mrs. Johnson said, setting aside her teacup. "With my hat, I presume." "Yes, madam," Jessie replied, keeping her eyes lowered as she presented the box. Mrs. Johnson opened it with a flourish, lifting the hat for her friends to admire. "Oh, it's even more beautiful than I expected. Ladies, you simply must see this beadwork." The hat was passed around the circle of women, drawing appreciative murmurs. "Who did this exquisite beading?" one woman asked. Before Jessie could slip away, Mrs. Johnson said, "Why, it was you, wasn't it, my dear?" Mrs. Porter mentioned her new assistant had quite the talent. Jessie nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "You must show your face when accepting a compliment, girl," another woman said, her tone sharp. "It's only polite." Heat flooded Jessie's cheeks as she reluctantly raised her head, though she kept her hair partially shielding her face. "My goodness, what happened to you?" a third woman exclaimed, clearly noticing the fading bruise on Jessie's jaw. "Did you have an accident?" Jessie's hand flew to her face, her breath catching. I should return to the shop," she stammered. "Mrs. Porter will be expecting me." Without waiting for dismissal, she turned and fled, the women's murmurs following her out the door. By the time she reached the street, tears were threatening. She had been naive to think the marks of her past would go unnoticed forever. Lost in her distress, she nearly collided with someone rounding the corner. "Whoa there," a familiar voice said as strong hands gently steadied her. "Miss Harper?" Vaughn Wilson looked down at her with concern, his hands immediately dropping away once she was stable on her feet. "Are you all right?" he asked, bending slightly to try to see her face, which she kept resolutely turned away. "Fine," she managed, her voice thick. "Excuse me, please." Instead of stepping aside, Vaughn remained where he was. "You don't seem fine," he said quietly. "Is there something I can do to help?" The simple question, offered without demand or expectation, broke something in Jessie. A sob escaped before she could stop it, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, mortified. "Here now," Vaughn said gently. "Let's get you somewhere quieter." He led her to a small side street where a bench sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Jessie sank onto it, struggling to regain her composure. Vaughn sat at the far end of the bench, giving her space. He didn't speak, simply waited patiently while Jessie wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered. I'm not." "No need to apologize," Vaughn assured her. "We all have days that get the better of us." Jessie nodded, still not looking at him. Her hair had fallen forward again, creating a curtain between them. After a moment of silence, Vaughn spoke again, his voice gentle. "Miss Harper, I hope you don't mind me saying so, but it seems to me you've been running from something, or someone." Jessie tensed, her hands tightening on her handkerchief. "You don't owe me any explanations," he continued. "But I want you to know that Gila Bend can be a fresh start. It was for me 6 years ago." That made Jessie glance up briefly. "You weren't born here," Vaughn shook his head. "Came from Texas, left some things behind I'd rather not revisit." His expression grew distant for a moment before he focused on her again. "What I'm trying to say, awkwardly I'll admit, is that whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." The words hung in the air between them. Jessie had been alone for so long emotionally, if not physically, that the mere suggestion of sharing her burden was overwhelming. "I should get back to the shop," she said finally, rising from the bench. Vaughn stood as well. "Of course. But Miss Harper," she paused, not quite looking at him. "My offer stands. If you ever want to talk, or just sit in silence with someone who understands what it means to start over well, you know where to find me." Jessie nodded once, then hurried away, her emotions a tangled mess she couldn't begin to sort through. The next few days passed in a blur of work as preparations for Founders' Day intensified. Jessie was grateful for the distraction, though Mrs. Johnson's visit to the shop, during which she asked pointed questions about the poor girl's unfortunate accident, left her shaken again. Mrs. Porter, to her credit, deflected the inquiries with practiced ease. After Mrs. Johnson left, the older woman gave Jessie a considering look but said only, "Some folks have nothing better to do than poke their noses where they don't belong. Best way to handle them is to give them nothing to gossip about." Jessie took the advice to heart, redoubling her efforts to remain invisible as she moved through the town. She varied her routes to and from the boarding house, kept her head down, and spoke only when necessary. But Gila Bend was small, and complete anonymity was impossible. Jessie began to notice the glances, the whispers that followed her. The women from Mrs. Johnson's tea had spread their observations, and now speculation about the quiet newcomer with the fading bruises was a favorite topic. "I heard she ran away from her husband back east," she overheard one woman telling another as they browsed ribbons in the shop. "Apparently, he's some kind of important businessman." "Well, I heard it was her father who beat her," the other replied, "and she stole family heirlooms before fleeing." Jessie's hands trembled as she worked, the lies cutting deeper than she would have expected. Was this to be her life in Gila Bend? Forever marked by rumors and half-truths, as July turned to August, bringing even more oppressive heat, Jessie's fears about Thomas finding her began to resurface. What if the gossip somehow reached him? The thought made her physically ill, and she began to consider whether she should move on, find another town where no one had yet formed opinions about her. The idea of leaving filled her with a strange reluctance, however. Despite everything, Gila Bend had become something like home in the past 2 months. She had her room at Mrs. Dalton's, her position at the millinery shop, and the beginnings of a small savings hidden beneath a loose floorboard. And then there was Vaughn Wilson. Though their interactions remained brief and mostly coincidental, Jessie had begun to look forward to their occasional meetings. He never pressed her for conversation, but seemed genuinely pleased when she offered it. There was a steadiness to him that called to something deep within her, a promise of safety she hadn't felt in years. Founders' Day arrived with fanfare on the second Saturday in August. The main street was decorated with bunting, and tables were set up in the shade of hastily erected canopies. Mrs. Porter had closed the shop for the occasion but asked Jessie to help her with the millinery display that would be part of the town's historical exhibition. "Wear your blue dress, dear," Mrs. Porter instructed. "It's a festive occasion." Jessie had been planning to avoid the celebration entirely, but she couldn't refuse Mrs. Porter after all the woman had done for her. So she donned her blue dress, her only other garment besides her two everyday dresses, and made her way to the town square. The celebration was already in full swing when she arrived. Children ran laughing between the displays, couples strolled arm in arm, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. For a moment, Jessie stood at the edge of it all, overwhelmed by the noise and activity. "Miss Harper, over here, Mrs." Porter waved from a table where she had arranged a collection of hats representing styles from the town's 20-year history. Jessie made her way over, keeping her eyes down and her hair arranged to shield her face as much as possible. "Perfect timing," Mrs. Porter said when she arrived. "I need to speak with Mrs. Henderson about the judging for the quilting competition. Would you mind watching the display for a bit? Just make sure no little hands disturb the hats." Before Jessie could protest, Mrs. Porter was gone, leaving her alone at the table. She stood awkwardly behind the display, hyper-aware of the crowd moving around her. Most people paused only briefly to admire the hats before moving on, barely noticing Jessie. But as the morning wore on, a group of women approached the same ones from Mrs. Johnson's tea party. "Well, if it isn't the mysterious Miss Harper," one of them said, her voice carrying enough that several heads turned in their direction. "Still hiding behind that curtain of hair, I see." Jessie's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes on the table, arranging and rearranging the display cards. "I heard the most interesting story from my cousin in Phoenix," another woman said loudly. "About a man looking for his runaway wife, described her just like our Miss Harper here. Ice shot through Jessie's veins. Thomas was looking for her. Had he traced her to Arizona? Isn't that something?" The first woman replied, "I wonder if the sheriff knows we're harboring a fugitive wife, ladies." Vaughn Wilson's voice cut through the malicious chatter. He had approached so quietly that none of them had noticed. "I believe Mrs. Henderson is looking for judges for the pie contest. Your refined palates would be most appreciated." The women exchanged glances, momentarily thrown off their course. "Of course," Mrs. Johnson said after a beat, "we would be delighted to help with the judging." As they moved away, casting backward glances at Jessie, Vaughn stepped closer to the table. "Don't pay them any mind," he said quietly. "They've got nothing better to do than make up stories about folks they don't understand." Jessie's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. "But what if it's true?" she whispered. "What if he's looking for me?" Vaughn's expression grew serious. "Is he your husband?" Jessie nodded almost imperceptibly, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "Did he do that?" Vaughn asked, gesturing vaguely toward her face where the bruise had faded but not completely disappeared. Another tiny nod. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, his jaw working. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but with an undercurrent of anger. "Then he'll have to come through me to get to you." The simple declaration stunned Jessie into looking up, meeting his gaze directly for once. There was no artifice in his expression, just a steady resolve that made her breath catch. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know enough," Vaughn replied. "I know you're kind and hardworking. I know you've got more talent in your fingertips than most folks have in their whole bodies, according to Mrs. Porter. And I know nobody deserves to live in fear." Before Jessie could respond, Mrs. Porter returned, breaking the moment. Vaughn tipped his hat to both women and moved away, quickly swallowed by the crowd. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Jessie. She helped Mrs. Porter with the display, accepted a plate of food she barely tasted, and tried to ignore the whispers that seemed to follow her. When the celebration began to wind down in the late afternoon, she slipped away, eager to return to the quiet of her room at the boarding house. The streets were mostly empty, with most of the town still at the square. Jessie walked quickly, her mind racing with thoughts of Thomas. If he had traced her to Phoenix, it might not be long before he arrived in Gila Bend. The thought sent panic coursing through her. Should she run again? Where would she go? So absorbed was she in these thoughts that she didn't notice the figure stepping out from between two buildings until it was too late. "Hello, Jessie." The voice froze her in her tracks, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. Thomas Harper stood before her, looking exactly as she remembered, tall and well-dressed, with a pleasant face that had fooled everyone back home into thinking he was the perfect gentleman. "You've led me on quite a chase," he said, his tone conversational though his eyes were cold. "Did you really think you could just run away from your husband, your duties?" Jessie couldn't speak, couldn't move. Fear held her rooted to the spot as Thomas took a step toward her. "You're coming home with me," he said, the pleasantness falling away. "Now." "No." The word was small but definite. Thomas's face hardened. "No, you don't have a choice, Jessie. You're my wife. Your place is with me. I'm not going back." Jessie's voice was stronger now, fueled by the terror of returning to the life she had escaped. "Not ever." Thomas lunged forward, grabbing her arm with bruising force. "You think I care what you want. You're nothing without me." "Nothing," Jessie struggled, trying to wrench her arm free, but Thomas's grip only tightened. His other hand shot out, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her head back painfully. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You've embarrassed me, humiliated me. Everyone back home knows my wife ran off like some common, let her go." Vaughn's voice cut through the air like a whip. Thomas's head snapped up, but he didn't release Jessie. "This is between me and my wife, stranger. Best mind your own business." Vaughn stood a few paces away, his stance relaxed but his eyes hard. In Gila Bend, a man putting his hands on a woman unwilling is everyone's business. Thomas sneered. "She's my wife. The law says I can discipline her as I see fit. Not in this town." Vaughn took a step closer. "Now let her go, or we're going to have a serious problem." For a moment, Thomas seemed to consider his options. Then, with a disgusted sound, he shoved Jessie away from him. She stumbled, catching herself against a post. "Fine," Thomas spat. "You want the whore, you can have her, but don't say I didn't warn you when she shows her true colors." Vaughn moved with surprising speed for a man his size. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between them and landed a punch that sent Thomas sprawling in the dirt. "Don't you ever speak about her that way again," Vaughn said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now get up and get out of Gila Bend. And if you come back, you'll be dealing with more than just me." Thomas got to his feet, wiping blood from his split lip. His eyes darted between Vaughn and Jessie, calculating. "This isn't over," he said finally, directing the words at Jessie. "You're still my wife under the law." "Actually," a new voice interjected, "that might not be entirely accurate." Sheriff Davis stepped into view, his badge catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Mrs. Dalton sent word that Miss Harper's husband might be causing trouble. I took the liberty of telegraphing the authorities in St. Louis, where I believe you're from, Mr. Harper." Thomas stiffened. "Whatever she's told you, she hasn't told me anything," the sheriff interrupted. "But the reply I got was mighty interesting. Seems there's an outstanding warrant for your arrest back in Missouri. Fraud and embezzlement, I believe, were the charges." The color drained from Thomas's face. "That's a mistake, no mistake," Sheriff Davis said firmly. "Now you've got two choices. You can leave Gila Bend immediately and never return, or I can lock you up and wait for the Missouri lawmen to come collect you. Which will it be?" Thomas's eyes darted around, like a trapped animal seeking escape. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'll go," he muttered. "Wise decision," the sheriff replied. "I'll escort you to the stage depot. There's one heading east in an hour." As the sheriff led Thomas away, Jessie sagged against the post, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. Vaughn was at her side in an instant, concern etched on his features. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Jessie shook her head, though her arm ached where Thomas had gripped it. How did the sheriff know about the warrant?" A small smile touched Vaughn's lips. "He didn't. Not until about 20 minutes ago when Mrs. Dalton suggested he might want to check. She's got a knack for knowing things about people. The realization that Thomas was truly gone, that he couldn't hurt her anymore, began to sink in, bringing with it a wave of emotion so powerful that Jessie swayed on her feet. "Whoa, easy there," Vaughn said, his hand hovering near her elbow but not quite touching. "Let me walk you back to Mrs. Dalton's. You've had quite a shock." Jessie nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. They walked in silence, Vaughn matching his pace to her slower steps. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Dalton was waiting on the porch, a shotgun propped casually against the railing. "All taken care of?" she asked, her eyes sharp. "Sheriff's escorting him to the stage," Vaughn confirmed. "He won't be back," Mrs. Dalton nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Miss Harper, I've got tea brewing, something stronger too if you've a need." "Thank you," Jessie managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'd just like to lie down for a while." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Dalton agreed. She turned to Vaughn. "Thank you for bringing her home safe, Mr. Wilson." Vaughn tipped his hat. "Madam," he looked at Jessie, his expression gentle, "you rest easy, Miss Harper, you're safe now." As Jessie climbed the stairs to her room, exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket. She barely managed to remove her shoes before collapsing onto the bed, the events of the day catching up with her all at once. She slept deeply for the first time in years, no longer listening for the sound of angry footsteps in the night. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the world somehow different though nothing had visibly changed. Jessie rose, washed and dressed with deliberate care. Today felt like the first day of something new, a life truly her own. Mrs. Dalton said nothing about the previous day's events when Jessie came down for breakfast, simply served her eggs and coffee with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. The normality of it was comforting. As Jessie was preparing to leave for church, something she had avoided until now, not wanting to face the town's scrutiny, Mrs. Dalton cleared her throat. "Miss Harper," she said carefully, "I hope you don't mind my interference yesterday. I've seen enough in my time to recognize a woman running from something bad. When that man came asking questions about you, well..." "Thank you," Jessie said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't sent for the sheriff." Mrs. Dalton nodded. "Well, Mr. Wilson would have handled him regardless, I suspect. That young man's taken quite a shine to you, if you don't mind my saying so." Jessie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's been kind, that's all." The older woman smiled knowingly but said only, "It's a fine day for church. Shall we walk together?" The small church at the end of Main Street was nearly full when they arrived. Jessie hesitated at the door, suddenly nervous about facing the town after yesterday's confrontation. News traveled fast in Gila Bend, everyone would know by now. "Head high, dear Mrs. Dalton murmured. "You've nothing to be ashamed of." They found seats near the back, and Jessie kept her eyes forward, though she could feel curious glances being directed her way. Just before the service began, there was a slight commotion as someone slipped into the pew beside her. "Miss Harper," Vaughn Wilson greeted her quietly. "Mrs. Dalton." Jessie glanced at him, surprised. Mrs. Porter had mentioned once that Vaughn rarely attended church, preferring to use Sundays for catching up on work at the livery. The service passed in a blur of hymns and scripture readings that Jessie barely registered, too aware of Vaughn's presence beside her. When it ended, she steeled herself for the inevitable curious approaches from the townspeople. They came, but not in the way she expected. Mrs. Johnson was the first, approaching with a hesitant smile. "Miss Harper," she said, her usual haughtiness tempered. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. My behavior was unbecoming." Jessie blinked in surprise. "Thank you, madam," she managed. Others followed, some with apologies, others simply offering kind words or introductions as if meeting her for the first time. Vaughn remained quietly at her side, his presence somehow making it easier to face them all. As they finally exited the church into the bright sunlight, Jessie felt a weight lifting that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The town's judgment had been one of her greatest fears, but it seemed that Gila Bend was willing to offer her a second chance. "Would you care to join me for dinner at the hotel, Miss Harper?" Vaughn asked as they paused on the church steps. "They do a fine Sunday roast." Jessie hesitated. A public meal with a man was something she hadn't considered since arriving in Gila Bend. But Vaughn's expression held no pressure, only a gentle invitation. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd like that." Mrs. Dalton beamed at them both. "Wonderful. I'll see you later this evening, Miss Harper. Don't rush on my account." The hotel dining room was busy with the after-church crowd, but the hostess found them a small table by the window. Vaughn held Jessie's chair for her, the gesture natural and respectful. Their conversation over the meal was halting at first, with Jessie unused to speaking about herself. But Vaughn was patient, sharing stories of his own journey to Gila Bend, how he'd come west after the war with nothing but the clothes on his back and away with horses. Texas wasn't home anymore, he explained. Too many ghosts, needed somewhere to start fresh. Jessie nodded, understanding completely. "That's why I came west too, to start over." Vaughn's eyes were warm as he looked at her. "And now, do you think Gila Bend could be home?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Jessie considered it carefully. "I think it could be," she said softly. If certain things were resolved." Vaughn nodded. "Like your marriage." "Yes." Jessie twisted her napkin in her lap. "Thomas said I'm still his wife under the law. There are ways to address that," Vaughn said carefully. "The sheriff might have some advice, and if there really are charges against Thomas back in Missouri, that could help your case." Jessie felt a flicker of hope. The idea of being legally free of Thomas was almost too much to contemplate. "Do you think it's possible?" "I do," Vaughn said firmly. "And I'd be happy to help in any way I can, if you'd allow it." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility. For the first time since arriving in Gila Bend, Jessie didn't immediately look away. Instead, she allowed herself to really see Vaughn Wilson, the kindness in his eyes, the strength in his weathered hands, the gentleness in his smile. "I'd appreciate that," she said finally. They finished their meal and walked slowly back toward Mrs. Dalton's, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the dusty street. At the foot of the boarding house steps, they paused. "Thank you for dinner," Jessie said, finding it easier now to meet his gaze. "And for yesterday, I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "I'm glad I was there," Vaughn replied simply. He hesitated, then added, "Miss Harper, Jessie, I hope you know that I don't expect anything from you. Your friendship is more than enough." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside her. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means a great deal to me." With a tip of his hat, Vaughn turned to go. Jessie watched him for a moment, then called after him. "Mr. Wilson." He turned back. "Vaughn, please." Jessie smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Vaughn, would you care to join me for a walk tomorrow evening?" "After work?" The joy that lit his face was answer enough, but he said, "I'd like that very much, Jessie." As summer gave way to fall, Jessie's life in Gila Bend transformed. With Sheriff Davis's help, she began the legal process to dissolve her marriage to Thomas, citing abandonment and cruelty. The news from Missouri that Thomas had indeed been arrested for his financial crimes strengthened her case considerably. Her work at the millinery shop continued to earn praise, and Mrs. Porter began teaching her the business side of running the shop. "I won't be around forever," the older woman explained. "Someone with your talent should know how to make a living from it." But the most significant change was in Jessie herself. Slowly, she began to stand straighter, to speak more confidently, to meet people's eyes when they spoke to her. The habit of hiding behind her hair remained, though less pronounced a shield she wasn't quite ready to discard entirely. Her friendship with Vaughn deepened through their evening walks and Sunday dinners. He never pushed, never pressed for more than she was ready to give. His patience and steady presence became a cornerstone of her new life. By October, the legal papers dissolving her marriage to Thomas arrived, and Jessie celebrated with a small dinner at Mrs. Dalton's, attended by the landlady herself, Mrs. Porter, Sheriff Davis, and, of course, Vaughn. To new beginnings, Mrs. Dalton toasted, raising her glass of sherry. And to good friends, Jessie added, looking around the table at the people who had become her chosen family. Later, as Vaughn walked her around the garden behind the boarding house, the crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and distant rain. "You seem happy tonight," Vaughn observed, his voice gentle in the darkness. "I am," Jessie replied. "For the first time in years I feel free." They paused beneath the old apple tree, its branches nearly bare now. Vaughn turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Jessie," he began, "I know we've only known each other a few months, but I've never met anyone like you. Your strength, your kindness, despite everything you've been through, it humbles me." Jessie's heart beat faster at his words, a mixture of joy and lingering fear coursing through her. "I don't want to rush you," Vaughn continued, "and if friendship is all you ever want from me, that's enough. But I needed you to know that I care for you deeply. And whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Tears pricked at Jessie's eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming tenderness of his declaration. No demands, no expectations, just an offer of love that asked nothing in return. "Vaughn," she whispered, her voice catching, "I care for you too, I'm just scared," he finished for her. "I know, and that's all right." Impulsively, Jessie reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her. "I'm learning not to be afraid," she said softly. "With your help." Vaughn's smile was tender as he gently squeezed her hand. "We've got all the time in the world, Jessie. No need to rush." The winter of 1878-79 was one of the coldest in memory for Gila Bend. Snow fell on the desert town in December, a rare enough occurrence that the children were let out of school to play in it. Jessie, now officially Mrs. Porter's assistant manager at the millinery shop, found herself busier than ever with orders for winter bonnets and hats. Her relationship with Vaughn progressed slowly, both of them savoring each small step forward. Their evening walks continued despite the cold, now accompanied by Bandit, a stray dog that had adopted Vaughn after wandering into the livery one stormy night. Christmas brought another first Jessie's attendance at the town's holiday celebration in the church hall. In years past, such gatherings had been opportunities for Thomas to showcase his perfect wife while whispering threats in her ear when no one was looking. But this celebration was different. Jessie helped decorate the hall, baked cookies with Mrs. Dalton, and even played the piano for some of the carols, a talent she had nearly forgotten she possessed. "You never cease to amaze me," Vaughn told her as they shared a cup of punch near the Christmas tree. "Is there anything you can't do?" Jessie laughed, another thing she was rediscovering. "Plenty. I'm a terrible cook, for one, and I can't whistle to save my life." "Tragic flaws," Vaughn agreed with mock seriousness. "I may have to reconsider our friendship." Their easy banter was interrupted by Mrs. Porter, who approached with a small wrapped package. "Merry Christmas, my dear," she said, pressing it into Jessie's hands. "A little something to celebrate your first year in Gila Bend." Inside the package was a delicate silver hairpin adorned with a small pearl. "It was my daughter's," Mrs. Porter explained. "She's in San Francisco now with her own family. I'd like you to have it." Touched beyond words, Jessie embraced the older woman. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Vaughn walked Jessie back to the boarding house through the gently falling snow. They paused at the gate, reluctant to end the magical evening. "I have something for you too," Vaughn said, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small box tied with a simple ribbon. "It's not much, but—" Jessie carefully untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside was a silver locket, plain but beautifully crafted. "Oh, Vaughn," she breathed. "It's lovely." "Open it," he urged softly. Inside the locket was a tiny pressed flower, a desert bloom that had been among the first signs of spring after she arrived in Gila Bend. "You once mentioned it was your favorite," Vaughn explained. "The first beautiful thing you noticed here." Tears filled Jessie's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. Would you put it on for me? She asked, turning and lifting her hair. Vaughn's fingers were gentle as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. When Jessie turned back to face him, something had shifted in the air between them. "Vaughn," she said softly, gathering her courage. "There's something I've wanted to do for a while now, but I've been afraid." His eyes were warm in the lamplight spilling from the boarding house windows. "What's that, Jessie?" Instead of answering, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, tentative, but filled with promise. When she pulled back, Vaughn's expression was one of wonder. "Was that all right?" he asked, his voice husky. Jessie nodded, a smile blooming on her face. "More than all right. May I?" he asked, his hands coming to rest lightly on her waist. At her nod, he bent his head and kissed her again, this time with more assurance. It was nothing like the demanding, possessive kisses Thomas had forced upon her. Vaughn's kiss was an offering, a promise, asking nothing and giving everything. When they parted, both a little breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "Merry Christmas, Jessie," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, Vaughn," she replied, her heart fuller than she had thought possible. The new year brought change to Gila Bend. The railroad expanded its operations, bringing more travelers and business to the small town. Mrs. Porter's shop benefited from the increased traffic, and Jessie found herself designing hats for ladies from as far away as San Francisco. As February approached, Vaughn became uncharacteristically secretive, disappearing for hours at a time and changing the subject whenever Jessie asked what he was doing. She tried not to let it worry her, trusting in the solid foundation of honesty they had built together, but old fears were hard to silence completely. On Valentine's Day, the mystery was finally revealed when Vaughn arrived at the boarding house in his Sunday best, asking Jessie to accompany him on a ride. "Where are we going?" she asked as he helped her into his buggy. "You'll see," he replied with a smile that did little to hide his nervousness. They drove out of town, following the river for about a mile before turning onto a smaller track. As they crested a small rise, a neat cabin came into view, set back from the road with a corral and small barn behind it. "Whose place is this?" Jessie asked, admiring the fresh paint and curtained windows. "Mine," Vaughn said, his voice suddenly serious. "Or it will be once the final papers come through. I've been working on it for months now." He helped her down from the buggy and led her toward the cabin. "I bought the land from old Mr. Henderson when he decided to move to Tucson to live with his daughter. The cabin needed a lot of work, but—" He trailed off as they reached the door, suddenly looking uncertain. "Would you like to see inside?" Jessie nodded, curious about this place that clearly meant so much to him. The interior was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A small kitchen area occupied one corner, and doors led off to what Jessie assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean and newly finished, the scent of sawdust and paint still lingering in the air. "It's beautiful, Vaughn," she said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "But I don't understand, what about the rooms above the livery?" Vaughn took a deep breath as if steeling himself. "I've been thinking about the future, Jessie, about what I want, who I want to share my life with." He took her hands in his eyes steady on hers. "I love you, Jessie Harper. I think I've loved you since that first day when you walked into town with your head down but your spine straight as an arrow. I saw your courage then, and I see it every day in the way you've built a new life, in the way you face the world despite everything you've been through." Jessie's heart raced as she realized what was happening. "Vaughn, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not asking for an answer today. I know you're still healing, still finding your way, but I want you to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, this home is for you, for us." Tears filled Jessie's eyes, blurring her vision. "You built this for me," she whispered. "For us," he repeated. "But only if you want it, Jessie, only if you want me." The magnitude of what he was offering, not just love but patience, understanding, a true partnership, overwhelmed her. She reached up, touching his face with trembling fingers. "I do want you, Vaughn," she said softly. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself. afraid that what happened with Thomas had broken something in me that couldn't be fixed. Vaughn turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm. Nothing about you is broken, Jessie. You're the strongest person I know. A tear slipped down her cheek, and instinctively she ducked her head, her hair falling forward to shield her face. With infinite gentleness, Vaughn reached out and brushed her hair back, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her cheek, tracing the spot where the bruise had long since faded. "Beautiful," he murmured, his eyes filled with such tenderness that Jessie felt it like a physical warmth. "So beautiful." The words, spoken not as a demand or an assessment, but as a simple truth, broke something open inside her. All the years of hiding, of making herself small, of believing Thomas's cruel words, they fell away in that moment. "I love you, Vaughn Wilson," she said, her voice clear and sure. "And yes, I want this. I want us." His smile was radiant as he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and for the first time in her life, Jessie believed that perhaps she was. They were married in April, when the desert was alive with wildflowers. The ceremony was small, just their closest friends gathered in the church where they had first sat side by side. Jessie wore a dress of pale blue that she and Mrs. Porter had worked on together, and in her hair, visible for all to see, was the pearl hairpin Mrs. Porter had given her for Christmas. Mrs. Dalton cried throughout the ceremony, clutching her handkerchief and declaring that she'd known all along they were perfect for each other. Sheriff Davis served as Vaughn's best man, while Mrs. Porter stood up with Jessie. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the pastor declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Vaughn's lips met hers, sealing their vows, Jessie felt the last shadows of her past life finally recede. This was her beginning, her true life chosen freely, with open eyes and an open heart. The cabin by the river became their home, filled with laughter and love. Jessie continued to work at the millinery shop, taking on more responsibility as Mrs. Porter began to consider retirement. Vaughn's livery stable thrived with the town's growth, and he took on 2 apprentices to help with the increasing workload. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch Vaughn had built, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. Sometimes they talked of the future, of children, of dreams, of hopes. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. In the spring of 1880, their family grew with the birth of their son, Michael James Wilson, who arrived with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair just like his father's. Jessie discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed during those long hours of labor, with Vaughn steady at her side. "He's perfect," Vaughn whispered as he held his son for the first time, all written across his face. "Just like his mother." Jessie smiled up at them, exhausted but filled with joy. "I never thought I could be this happy," she admitted. "I never thought I deserved it." Vaughn sat carefully on the edge of the bed, cradling their son in one arm while taking her hand with his free one. "You deserve every happiness, Jessie Wilson, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." As Michael grew from infant to toddler, their home rang with his laughter and the patter of his little feet. Vaughn proved to be a natural father, patient and playful, teaching their son about horses and the desert with the same quiet confidence he approached everything. Mrs. Porter finally retired in 1882, selling the millinery shop to Jessie for a sum far below its worth. "Consider it an investment in the future," the older woman insisted. "I know you'll make it even more successful," and she did. Under Jessie's guidance, the shop expanded to include dressmaking services, attracting customers from throughout the territory. Her designs became sought after, known for their elegance and craftsmanship. In 1883, their daughter Catherine arrived, completing their family. Where Michael was all energy and motion, Catherine was thoughtful and observant, watching the world with serious eyes that gradually lightened from newborn blue to match her father's warm brown. "She looks like you," Vaughn often said, watching Jessie rock their daughter to sleep. "Poor child," Jessie would tease. though the old insecurities had long since faded. Years of Vaughn's steady love and the reflection of herself she saw in her children's eyes had healed wounds she once thought permanent. The town of Gila Bend continued to grow around them, transforming from a dusty outpost to a proper community with a school, a larger church, and even a small hotel for travelers. Jessie and Vaughn grew with it, becoming respected fixtures in the town they both now called home. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vaughn surprised Jessie with a trip to San Francisco, a city she had always wanted to see. They left the children in Mrs. Dalton's capable hands, though she was moving a bit slower these days, and spent a week exploring the bustling metropolis. On their last night, as they stood on a hillside overlooking the bay, Vaughn wrapped his arms around Jessie from behind, holding her close against the evening chill. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. "About choosing Gila Bend, about choosing me?" Jessie turned in his arms to face him, noting the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples. The years had been kind to him, adding character to his handsome face without diminishing the strength and warmth that had first drawn her to him. "Not a single one," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "You gave me back myself, Vaughn. You helped me find the woman I was always meant to be." His smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture that had become a cherished ritual between them, a reminder of how far they had come. "Beautiful," he murmured, just as he had that day in the cabin years ago. "Inside and out." As they returned to Gila Bend, and the life they had built together, their children rushing to meet them, their friends welcoming them home, their businesses waiting for their return, Jessie knew that this was the true meaning of happiness. Not the absence of pain or the guarantee that no storms would ever come, but the certainty that whatever life brought, they would face it together, with love and courage. The frightened woman who had stumbled into Gila Bend hiding behind her hair was still part of her, a reminder of her strength and resilience. But she was no longer defined by her past. Instead, she was Jessie Wilson, wife, mother, businesswoman, friend, loved and loving, seen and valued, complete.